I lost the game. I was forced to ask for the contact information of the handsome guy at the next table. After scanning his code and adding him, I discovered he was already on my friends list. He had been sending me greetings every year on holidays and birthdays. For 7 long years. Ding! This novel reminds you to click the subscribe button in the bottom right corner to read the complete novel. Can I get your contact info? I asked. The table next to us went quiet for a moment. I smiled softly and waved my phone. Lost a game, you know how it is. The others politely looked away. Only the handsome guy I'd singled out hadn't looked up once. With my friends still eagerly watching, I had no choice but to ask again. Is that all right? He finally looked up, staring at me intently. His gaze was quite intimidating, like a lion eyeing its prey after a long hunger, almost glowing with intensity. I found it a bit strange. He seemed like such a genteel, refined type of handsome guy. Even the way he clinked glasses and drank was elegant and graceful. Afraid of rejection, I softened my tone. Please help me out? I rarely act coy, but in my experience, it's almost always effective. Sure enough, he nodded. All right, he said, his voice a bit hoarse. He took out his phone, pulled up a QR code, and after what seemed like a major internal debate, slowly held it up for me to see. I scanned the code, but instead of a friend request, I could message him directly. He was already on my friends list? I gave him a puzzled look, half doubting as I opened our chat history. The screen was filled with white message bubbles, all from him. L. Happy birthday. L. Happy Christmas. L. Happy Easter. As I scrolled down, I saw he'd sent wishes for every holiday and birthday over the years. The messages went back to 2015. At the very top was a system message: you've added L as a friend. You can start chatting now. I suddenly felt short of breath. This guy my friends were praising as the epitome of pure sex appeal had been my friend since year 7? I looked up at him. He was looking at me too, his eyes both evasive and determined. In that moment, I understood. He liked me. My friend hugged me from behind, eagerly prying. What's taking so long? Did you add him or not? I nervously locked my phone screen and said casually, yeah, I did. She happily pulled me away. I glanced back at the handsome guy one last time. He had lowered his eyes, as if nothing had happened. I waved my phone at him. Thanks, I said. As the party wound down, a light rain fell from the darkening sky. I sat on a sofa in the lobby, waiting for someone to pick me up. Just then, I saw a boisterous group from the next table heading out. They were chattering loudly, suddenly filling the quiet lobby with noise. One of them spotted me and nudged the handsome bloke, gesturing with his eyes for him to look my way. He didn't spare me a glance, instead going to the front desk to settle the bill. After paying, he asked for an umbrella at the reception and strolled towards me. Here, he said, placing the umbrella on the coffee table in front of me. I'm waiting for my boyfriend, I replied. He froze for a moment but still set down the umbrella, then stood up saying, That's not a problem. As he was about to leave, I quickly asked, What's your name? Lucian Ainsworth, he answered. I'd heard that name before, more than once. The academic star for all 3 years of 6th form, consistently top of the class. The teacher's model student, and a legend among even the brightest pupils. But I vaguely remembered that the face on the honors board didn't look quite like this. I sent a message to my best friend asking for help. And she immediately sent me a photo of Lucian from 6th form. I studied it carefully. I realized his features were still similar, but his whole demeanor was vastly different. In 6th form, Lucian had the typical look of a swot, with a somewhat vacant expression, like a bookworm. Now, having shed his awkwardness, he was exceptionally handsome. The thin-framed glasses perched on his face added an air of refined restraint, while his every movement exuded an irresistible charm. As soon as he'd sat down, our table had been captivated. Marveling at how much he'd changed. I checked my phone to find 20 minutes had passed, and my boyfriend still hadn't arrived. I got up to go to the entrance to meet him. Instead of my boyfriend, I encountered Lucian still waiting under a tree not far away. He was alone, his friends had likely left long ago. When he saw me, he tried to hide behind the tree trunk, as if he didn't want me to see him. I instantly realized he was waiting for me. I tightened my grip on the umbrella and walked over to him. "Were you waiting for me to return the umbrella?" He stammered, "No." "Then why are you still here when the rain has stopped?" He remained silent. I asked directly, "You fancy me, don't you? Why haven't you said anything?" From our chat history, it seemed he'd fancied me for quite some time. He pointedly said, "You have a boyfriend." "You always do," he added. I didn't think that was a valid reason. But lots of blokes tell me they fancy me even though they know I have a boyfriend. He fell silent again. A sports car whizzed past behind me. And he pulled me into his arms in alarm, urgently saying, "Careful." His chest was heaving, and he seemed very nervous. Held in his embrace, I could only look straight ahead. The sports car had stopped in front of the club, and the two people in the driver's seat were still kissing passionately. After a while, the passenger door opened and a tall man with long legs stepped out. My boyfriend. Or rather, my ex-boyfriend now. He took out his phone and looked down to make a call. Soon, the phone in my hand lit up. I answered, and his voice was full of affection. "Babe, I'm here." "Where are you? Why don't you go back to snogging in the car?" It was quite a show. He hesitated for a moment, looking around with his phone in hand. I hung up immediately. Looking up at Lucien again, I saw his lips were tightly pressed together. As if he wanted to smile but didn't dare, holding it back firmly. I said, "Well, I don't have a boyfriend anymore." His smile faded, and he said seriously, "So, may I court you? The guy who said he wanted to pursue me hasn't made a move in days. My best friend keeps asking me for updates daily, to the point where even she's getting anxious." "Are all top students this reserved?" she wondered. "Not necessarily," I replied. I remember the last top student I dated was quite smooth, actually. My friend snorted with laughter. "You make yourself sound like a player." I rolled over contentedly on my bed. "Weren't you the one who said it'd be a waste of my good looks if I didn't date around a bit?" My friend perked up with interest. "So does our high school genius stand a chance then? We'll see how he performs." "But what's the deal with Hugo Sterling?" my friend continued. "I never imagined he'd cheat. Didn't he say he'd die for you when he was pursuing you back then?" The memory made me chuckle. After a good laugh, I answered, "He said he'd find a sugar mummy to support me." My friend laughed too. "And the sugar mummy was okay with that?" "No idea, but I certainly wasn't." After some more idle chatter, just before hanging up, my friend warned me. "You really need to be careful of Hugo Sterling. I don't think he'll give up so easily." "I know," I assured her. Hugo Sterling was indeed no pushover. But then again, I wasn't the one caught kissing someone else in a car, so I didn't have much to fear. The next day, I went to work as usual. Just before clocking out, I received a message from the long-silent Lucien Ainsworth. "Elle, may I take you out for dinner tonight?" It was just a short line, but I felt a surge of excitement, as if I'd been waiting for his message all along. Yet I hadn't felt much for him initially. I couldn't help but wonder if this was Lucien's strategy. If he had been just an ordinary pursuer, chasing after me like the others the very next day, I probably wouldn't have given it a second thought. But his neither here nor there approach, coupled with our awkward reunion, actually made me look forward to our interactions. I swiftly replied, "Sure." His response followed promptly. "I'm waiting outside your office building. Let me know when you're ready." I raised an eyebrow in surprise. "Did I tell you where I work?" He went silent again. I couldn't help but smile. Whenever I asked something crucial, he'd clam up. He was truly a master at playing dead. Finally, it was time to clock out. I grabbed my bag and headed downstairs. Lucien was waiting for me at the entrance. He was leaning against a car, dressed in a white shirt and black trousers. His delicate yet refined face gave off an aura of understated flamboyance. Just like the car, low-key yet luxurious. He welcomed me into the car and asked politely, "What would you like for dinner?" I smiled as I studied him. That's odd. You even know where I work. Didn't you find out what I like to eat? He paused for a second, then admitted with a suppressed smile, I did. Then shall we go to the Grand Restaurant? I've already made a reservation. I nodded. As we drove towards the Grand, Lucien explained. There was an unexpected issue with a project we were wrapping up. I've been busy dealing with it these past few days. I nodded in understanding, then added, I thought you were doing it on purpose. Doing what on purpose? Keeping me on the hook. He looked at me seriously and said, I wouldn't do that. Upon arriving at the Grand, the waiter skillfully led us to a window-side table. We had just sat down and were about to order when a delighted voice came from behind me. Penny? Is that really you? I looked up to see my ex-boyfriend, the top student. He beamed with joy. I knew I'd run into you if I came here for dinner. You always loved the house specials here, especially that tofu dish. You never got tired of it. He rambled on, making me quite uncomfortable. Especially in front of Lucien. My ex finally noticed Lucien's presence. His expression changed slightly as he tilted his head and asked me, Is this your boyfriend? No, I answered. For some reason, he suddenly became overly familiar, putting his arm around Lucien's shoulders and speaking in a tone of someone who knew better. Buddy, cut your losses while you can. Don't pursue her. Look at me, it's been 2 years since we broke up and I still haven't gotten over her. This woman is nothing but trouble. The sooner you give up, the better. Lucien brushed off his hand and looked up calmly. Your friend is waiting for you. My ex glanced back, exchanged a few more pleasantries, then left. The atmosphere became tense. I studied Lucien's expression and tentatively said, So, are you going to cut your losses? Lucien was wiping his hands with a napkin, seemingly the hand that had just touched my ex. He looked up calmly, as if asking me, After 7 years, how could I possibly give up now? The atmosphere remained harmonious thereafter. Lucien Ainsworth wasn't particularly talkative, but his speech was measured. Every sentence he uttered struck just the right balance, never making me feel uncomfortable. I guessed his emotional intelligence must be quite good. From the bits and pieces of our conversation, I also pieced together an impressive image of Lucien. A graduate from a prestigious university, he had started a company with a senior schoolmate, focusing on artificial intelligence. They had achieved some success, having recently signed a major deal. You came to find me on the day we were celebrating, he said. I immediately thought back to that night, quite curious. What were you thinking when I came to exchange contact information? He fell silent again, pretending to be oblivious. But this time I wasn't going to let him off easily. I probed, Were you nervous? I was thinking, he finally spoke, his voice somewhat muffled. That you really didn't remember me after all. Though I hadn't done anything to wrong him, I inexplicably felt like I was being unfaithful. I decided to explain. You've changed a lot. The academic star from high school I remember didn't look like this, so. My explanation seemed to make his expression even gloomier, so I quickly added. But as soon as you mentioned Lucien Ainsworth, I remembered. You were truly impressive, it left a deep impression on me. And, you're very handsome now, I added softly. He smiled faintly and said, I know, I don't blame you. I only blame myself for not being able to attract you, he added slowly, looking up. In that moment of eye contact, my heart skipped a beat. I decided to retract my judgment that Lucien wasn't smooth. From tonight's interaction, he seemed even smoother than my ex-boyfriend, the academic star. After dinner, Lucien drove me home. As we approached the entrance of my neighborhood, he suddenly stopped the car. Puzzled, I asked, What's wrong? He pointed to a tall figure not far away and asked, Is that your ex-boyfriend? I looked where he was pointing, and indeed it was Hugo Sterling. Half of his body was hidden behind a street tree. His profile flickering in the streetlight, his entire figure shrouded in the night. You couldn't see him clearly without looking carefully. I nodded and said it was. Lucien was still staring. I was about to ask what was wrong when he asked, What's he holding in his hand? I strained my eyes to look again. I couldn't really see clearly, but I could guess. It's probably a knife. He has a habit of flipping knives when he's bored. Lucien looked at me in shock. I guessed he might have misunderstood, so I explained seriously. It's a kind of fancy knife flipping. What he's holding is probably a butterfly knife. Whatever kind of knife it is, it can hurt people, he said. He probably wouldn't go so far as to. I vaguely recalled my best friend's warning and couldn't quite finish the sentence. I've looked into your ex-boyfriend. I'm not comfortable with this, Lucien stated matter-of-factly. He has a record of violent assault at the police station. Actually, that was because of jealousy. I wanted to say this, but then I thought, given that Lucien and I were appearing together right now, wasn't this the perfect opportunity for Hugo to get jealous? Or, his voice suddenly became hoarse, do you want to get out and clear things up with him? Seeing my silence, he added, I want to go with you. Can you beat him in a fight? I don't know, he answered, but I can protect you. His words made me feel that getting out of the car now would be a grave sin. As I hesitated, my phone rang. The caller ID showed Hugo. Looking up, I saw he had already walked out from the shadows. Hugo was holding his phone with one hand, his gaze fixed intently on the car I was in. His other hand was still carelessly flipping the knife, the sharp blade passing dangerously close to his fingertips. The dazzling yet risky movements, combined with his cold face, were particularly unnerving. I belatedly felt afraid and asked helplessly, what do we do now? Lucien pondered briefly, then stepped on the accelerator decisively. Let's go to my house. It was already 10 p.m. when we arrived at Lucien's house. As I entered the lift, my best friend happened to send a message. Hugo just called me several times. Are you all right? Hugo had been bombarding me with calls on the way, which I found annoying. So I simply blocked him. I didn't expect him to start calling my best friend instead. I replied that I was fine and briefly explained what had happened tonight, telling her to block him too. She sent a flurry of messages in response. My phone kept pinging, causing Lucien to glance over repeatedly. My friend was clearly upset, so I focused on texting to calm her down, not paying much attention to Lucien's feelings. This continued until we got inside. Lucien handed me paper and pen, saying, You'll likely stay overnight. Write down anything you need, and I'll go buy it now. Busy replying to messages, I absent-mindedly said, I'll make do with whatever's here. Make do with everything? He questioned, glancing at my phone again. His voice was taut as a wire as he asked. Do you have so much to discuss with your ex-boyfriend? Aw. I hesitated, holding up my phone. This is my best friend. He rubbed his nose, looking somewhat embarrassed. Sorry. It's fine. I put away my phone and dutifully wrote down the items I'd need for an overnight stay. As I handed him the list, I sincerely said, Thank you. Lucien sheepishly took it and was about to leave when my friend made a video call. He froze, looking like he wanted to see but didn't dare look too closely. I was about to explain, but he left without a word. When I answered the call, my friend sighed deeply. You scared me to death. You didn't reply for so long, I thought Hugo had found you. Where are you now? She stared in shock at my surroundings visible in the video. At Lucien's house, I answered slowly. She was silent at first, then squealed in delight. After her excited cheering, she quickly changed the subject to pry into my relationship with Lucien, saying she felt reassured knowing he was protecting me. I couldn't refute anything she said. She was like an overzealous fan shipping her favorite couple, completely ignoring what the actual people involved were saying. Influenced by my friend's enthusiasm, I felt slightly awkward when Lucien returned. He handed me a paper bag, saying concisely, some shops were closed. I bought substitutes. That's fine. He ran my bathwater, showed me where the slippers were, playing the perfect host. When I came out of the bathroom, he had even made up the guest room bed for me, with 2 books I'd shared on social media placed on the bedside table. His care was truly impeccable. I said sincerely, Thank you so much for tonight. You know I have ulterior motives, he replied. Such honesty left me with nothing more to say. While Lucien was in the shower, I watched a school-themed film in the living room. The story of a genius male lead and a ditzy female lead was engrossing. But my mind kept wandering to Lucien. In the film, the female lead pursued the male lead but was rejected because he prioritized his studies. I found myself thinking that dating Lucien might not be so bad after all. Just then, my phone rang. An unknown number. I answered, and it was Hugo again. I was thoroughly annoyed. What do you want? Who's that man? None of your business. Baby, give me one more chance. I'll do whatever you say from now on. His words were earnest, his promises humble. I just want to give you a better life. I was speechless. I truly love you. No one can love you more than I do. I really couldn't listen anymore. I fell silent and turned away, only to find that Lucien had finished his shower and was now sitting nearby. He wore simple loungewear, his hair slightly damp, focused on peeling an orange. He peeled it meticulously, his movements gentle and slow. After removing the orange peel, he even carefully removed the pith from each segment. It should have been a gentle scene, but I sensed danger. For no apparent reason, I recalled that night we met again at the bar. And his deep, intense gaze like that of a wild beast. Before I knew it, I had pressed the end call button. Lucien handed me the peeled orange and asked softly, "Your ex-boyfriend?" I nodded slowly. This time he didn't say anything, just smiled faintly. Why did you choose him as your boyfriend back then? He was handsome and loved me. Just that? I nodded. I occasionally needed a boyfriend to help fend off unwanted admirers and such. Lucien was silent for a long while. It wasn't until I popped the last orange segment into my mouth that he spoke again. Can I try? Occasionally helping you fend off admirers and such. He smiled again, as if self-mockingly. Even if not as a boyfriend. So that's how you two got together? My best friend asked in surprise. I'm not even sure if we're actually together, I replied. My friend was even more shocked. You don't know if you're in a relationship or not. I found it absurd too, but I still said, it's just, he's very strange. He doesn't check my phone or ask who I'm with. I added, sometimes I get flirty texts on my phone. He sees them, but he doesn't care at all. Doesn't he get jealous? I nodded. And when we go out for dinner and run into his colleagues, he doesn't introduce me as his girlfriend. Is Lucien just shy? My friend asked. Not to that extent, surely. I thought for a moment before saying. It's been 2 weeks since that night, and he hasn't even held my hand. Bloody hell. My friend was completely shocked. But he is genuinely good to me, does everything I ask. Whenever I need him, he's always by my side. What is this? My friend muttered. Is Lucien really just using himself as a shield against other suitors? I couldn't argue with that assessment. Maybe he doesn't know how to be in a relationship, my friend suggested. I mean, look at how he sent you those New Year's wishes for 7 years straight. That doesn't seem like someone who knows how to date. I'm starting to doubt if he even likes me, I confessed. He definitely likes you. Look, he's been doing it for 7 years, my friend said confidently. 7 years, who else could do that? I pursed my lips. My friend asked, did Lucien ever say why he likes you? Probably because of my looks, I laughed. All my ex-boyfriends, which one didn't like me for my face? My friend suddenly fell into deep thought. What's wrong? Now that you mention your exes, I think you might be the one with the problem here. Huh? Her eyes lit up with realization. I remember you complaining to me more than once about how annoying it was when your boyfriends checked your phone, called to check up on you every day. Got jealous over nothing, constantly tried to show you off as their girlfriend. And were always trying to get handsy. She continued, but now with Lucien, he doesn't do any of that, and you're still bothered? I protested, I just think it's weird. Well, if Lucien did all those things, would it annoy you? I silently thought to myself that it probably wouldn't. My friend read everything from my expression and declared. Well, there you have it. Since Lucien doesn't know how, we'll just have to teach him. Teach him how to be in a relationship? That's so strange. My friend probed. Well, if he's so annoying and doesn't even know how to be in a relationship, why don't you just dump him like you did with the others? I thought for a moment and said, I think I'll teach him instead. It was as if someone had handed me a pillow just as I was feeling drowsy. 1 second, my best friend and I were discussing how to teach Lucian Ainsworth about dating. And the next, my phone buzzed with a new message. I opened it to find a dinner invitation from a client. The message above it read, I really like you. Will you be my girlfriend? My friend immediately said, screenshot it and send the picture to the brainiac. I nodded appreciatively. Clever idea. After sending the image, we eagerly awaited Lucian's reaction. He replied with 3 words, what's the matter? Recall it, my friend suggested. Say you sent it by mistake. Let him stew over it. I bet he won't be able to sit still. I did as she advised, only to receive an even calmer response from Lucian. Aren't you having dinner with Maggie tonight? Maggie is my best friend. We looked at each other, both marveling at how Lucian never seemed to follow the usual script. After some deliberation, we decided to play along with Lucian's question. Maggie's gone home, I replied. Lucian's message came quickly. Shall I pick you up then? We could have dinner together. All right, I responded. My friend, who had been watching the whole exchange, rubbed her chin thoughtfully. I'm starting to think he's quite skilled at this. Oh. He didn't openly show jealousy, but he quietly resolved the situation. Thinking about it, I realized she was right. So is he genuinely clueless or just pretending? Not sure, my friend said. We'll have to keep observing. After my friend left, I waited in the shopping center until 5 o'clock when Lucian finally appeared. His timing was a bit unfortunate, though. At that moment, I was being chatted up by someone. A man was pestering me for my contact details. I had refused, but he was persistent and kept following me. Lucian saw someone next to me and tactfully stopped at a distance. I was quite annoyed. Isn't this usually when the boyfriend comes over and puts his arm around his girlfriend to mark his territory? I pointed at Lucian and said, my boyfriend's here. Only then did the man give up. Lucian approached, and I turned away sullenly, giving him a view of my back. At least he knew to follow me, tugging at my sleeve and anxiously asking what was wrong. I said, your girlfriend was being hit on, and you just stood there. What do you think is wrong? He was silent for a moment, then spoke softly and slowly, may I? Call you my girlfriend. Why couldn't you? I was puzzled. I am your girlfriend. He smiled, looking relieved as he responded, all right. We walked side by side for a while before he asked, what about being jealous? I immediately understood what he meant and answered, that's allowed. How about holding hands? He asked next. He asked so seriously, but I couldn't help letting my imagination run wild. If he asks permission for everything, then for other things in the future. I quickly stopped that train of thought and replied seriously, that's allowed. Soon, I felt a warm, dry touch in my palm. He held my hand tightly. He said, it's my first time holding hands. I'm a bit nervous. Please forgive me if I'm doing anything wrong. My heart skipped a beat. I was still perplexed. Does this man know what he's doing or not? Lucian Ainsworth had improved considerably after some coaching. Although his approach to romance was still somewhat awkward, overall there was progress. Everything was going smoothly. The only hiccup was that Hugo Sterling had been released from jail. Recently, his rich female sponsor found out that he had a girlfriend. That rich woman was furious and quite influential, managing to get him locked up for the maximum 15-day detention. After those 15 days, Hugo's first move upon release was to contact me again. Lucian was worried. To prevent Hugo's harassment, I moved in with Lucian, reluctantly starting our life of cohabitation. It was because of this that I discovered Lucian was actually Mrs. Thompson's grandson. He even had a photo of them together on his desk. Seeing my surprise at the photo, Lucian said, I thought you knew. He explained, that's why I added you on social media back then, because of my grandmother. I truly had no recollection, only remembering Mrs. Thompson mentioning she had a very accomplished grandson. Lucien seemed understanding, saying, "That makes sense, you must get so many friend requests." That feeling of being a terrible person suddenly washed over me again. But it really wasn't my fault. I was part of the student council in secondary school and university. Later, due to the nature of my work, I had to add many clients as contacts. This meant I generally wouldn't refuse new friend requests. I'd keep those with legitimate business and immediately delete any that seemed dubious. Over time, my contact list still ended up quite extensive. As a result, the holiday greetings Lucien had sent over the past 7 years were buried in a sea of unread messages. It wasn't that I didn't want to reply, there were simply too many messages to manage. I decided to circle back to the original topic. "Did Mrs. Thompson ask you to add me?" "No, it was my own idea," he said. "My grandmother was always talking about this young woman who would visit and take care of her, keeping her company and being so attentive and patient. She praised you to the skies, making me very curious to know what you were really like." I felt an unusual nervousness. "Were you disappointed when you finally met me?" He shook his head. "I just hadn't expected you to be so beautiful as well." I thought I detected the key point. "You don't like me just because I'm pretty, do you?" "I think you're beautiful because I like you," he said, gazing at me with a smile. "Though you are genuinely very beautiful." I felt some long-held belief crumbling in my mind. I had always thought people liked me for my looks, but that wasn't the case with Lucien. He liked me for my kindness. Lucien continued praising me, recounting all the little things I had done for Mrs. Thompson over the years, sincerely thanking me for everything. I suddenly felt unworthy of such genuine affection. Because I wasn't truly kind. I had ulterior motives. He said, "I actually visited my grandmother quite often in secondary school, but never managed to run into you. Later she told me you usually visited your parents on weekends." I nodded. "My father remarried, and so did my mother." Lucien looked at me quietly. I decided to be honest. "I'm not as good as you think. I lived alone in that house, and would get scared even hearing footsteps in the stairwell during the day. That's why I would go keep Mrs. Thompson company, because when I was with her, she was also keeping me company. On the surface it looked like she needed me, but the truth is I always wanted to be needed by her. I was so afraid that one day she would kick me out too. After my parents remarried, they each had their own families and children. I felt like a football being kicked back and forth. Even though I would visit them weekly with a forced smile, it never earned me any parental affection. During the most sensitive time of adolescence, I was constantly plagued by one question. Am I unwanted? I didn't want to think that way, and tried hard not to, but I couldn't help feeling insecure. I gradually came to enjoy the feeling of being needed. As long as I was needed, I could push myself to do my absolute best. Being the center of attention, not being ignored, feeling indispensable, all of these gave me a sense of security. Why isn't that good? Lucien asked. You're already good enough. How much better do you need to be? It's just, I tried to explain. I didn't help her out of pure kindness. I'm not as good as you think I am. It felt like I wasn't quite worthy of Lucien's pure affection. But he said, then isn't my interest in you because you helped my grandmother not pure affection either? I was left speechless by his words. He took the initiative to embrace me, placing his warm hand on top of my head. There's no such thing as pure or impure. In my eyes, you are simply the best. In that moment, I suddenly felt the warmth I had been craving for so long. Like a person who had been wandering the desert for ages finally finding water. I wanted to lose myself in this embrace forever and ever. Lucien took me to visit Mrs. Thompson over the weekend. The old lady still lived in that narrow, old alley. Lucien and his family had offered to take her in and care for her. But she was probably too attached to her old home and refused to move no matter what they said. With no other choice, Lucien and his family hired a caregiver to look after her daily, while they also visited frequently. Mrs. Thompson was getting on in years and had some memory issues. Her eyesight was poor and she couldn't recognize people clearly. But she still babbled happily when she saw her grandson arrive. She babbled at me too, and even placed Lucien's hand on top of mine. I was deeply moved as I watched this scene unfold. After leaving Mrs. Thompson's house, Lucien and I walked down that narrow alley. Perhaps it was revisiting an old place, but I suddenly felt the urge to open up. Pointing at a shabby little flat on the 3rd floor, I said, "I lived there for all 3 years of secondary school. There used to be a big tree here, and sometimes at night the wind would blow the branches against the window, scaring me awake." "What happened after that?" Lucien asked. "I moved out after that," I replied. "When I started 6th form, my mum graciously said she'd let me live with her. I was so happy at first because I really wanted to be with her. But little did I know living under someone else's roof would be worse than living on my own." "Were you not happy living at your mum's?" "No, I wasn't," I answered honestly. "Once, my stepdad peeped at me in the shower and I caught him. I made a fuss to my mum about it, but she said he just accidentally walked in by mistake and even defended him. After that, I stopped going back to that home much. I'd rather wander the streets on weekends than go home and deal with their fake family affection." Lucien's expression was pained as he listened. "Then I started dating boys around that time too. I can't really remember much about them now. But I clearly recall the feeling they liked me so much, and I wanted to know what it felt like to be liked that way." Lucien only asked, "Did dating make you happier?" To be honest, it didn't. I tried to fill the emptiness inside me with relationships. But I discovered that no matter how many times I dated, the emptiness remained unfilled. But now, it seems Lucien might be able to fill that void. I looked at him and asked seriously, "I dated one boy after another right in front of you. Weren't you jealous?" He held my hand, his gaze sincere. "I don't care about your past. As long as I'm in your future, that's all that matters." I thought to myself, he's quite understanding. At the same time, I was grateful for that night when I casually agreed with a simple I had originally agreed to be with Lucien just to give it a try. Like many times before, but now I'm so glad I did. Lucien is truly wonderful, wonderful enough that I'm willing to consider spending a lifetime with him. After the weekend, it was back to work on Monday. As it neared the end of the workday, Lucien suddenly messaged to say he had something come up and couldn't pick me up. I quietly replied okay. Actually, Hugo Sterling hadn't caused any trouble recently. I guessed he had given up, but Lucien was still worried and insisted on driving me to and from work. It was still perfectly safe commuting home alone. Hugo didn't come to harass me, so I even stopped by the supermarket to buy some groceries. I made 4 dishes and a soup, waiting for Lucien to come home. In the end, I didn't wait for Lucien, but instead got a call from the hospital. An unfamiliar male voice on the other end of the line said urgently, "Lucien's been hurt. You'd better come to the hospital quickly." It wasn't until we reached the hospital that I learned Lucien's injury was entirely caused by Hugo Sterling. Hugo had found out that Lucien was my current boyfriend, and also discovered that it was Lucien who had leaked information about Hugo's timing to his female sponsor. With old and new grudges combined, Hugo came after Lucien with his butterfly knife. Lucien was in the middle of a business meeting and caught off guard, which is how he ended up injured. I asked, "How bad are his injuries?" "Not sure, but he managed to block with his hand in the heat of the moment. So it probably didn't hit any vital spots," the person replied. "That bloke was taken away by the police. He'll likely be locked up for a few days, maybe longer depending on Lucien's injury assessment report." I was instantly overwhelmed with a mix of emotions: guilt, self-blame, and regret. How could I have been so blind to date someone like Hugo Sterling? Waiting outside the emergency room was bound to be agonizing. Even though his friend kept reassuring me that this wasn't my fault, I couldn't help but take on the blame. How could it not be related to me? My ex-boyfriend attacking my current boyfriend, it all traced back to me. The doctor finally came out and briefly explained, "We've treated the wounds. The stab wound on his chest is the deepest. We're concerned it might affect his lung, so it's best he stays in hospital for observation for a couple of days." I nodded blankly. His friend went to handle the hospital admission paperwork, but not before saying to Lucien, Your girl's feeling really guilty. Better comfort her. Lucien was sitting in a wheelchair, his complexion slightly pale and his arm wrapped in a conspicuous bandage. But he was smiling at me, his voice gentle. I'm fine, you know. The more he acted like this, the more I wanted to cry. My gaze scanned his injuries like radar, one on his arm, one on his chest, and a slash on his waist. I asked him, does it hurt? He shook his head and said, it doesn't hurt. I didn't believe him. He added, I got him too. Kicked him to the ground. I'm tough, oh no, don't cry. His voice instantly filled with panic. I didn't want to cry either, but I couldn't help it. I sniffled and crouched down beside his wheelchair, apologizing sincerely. I'm so sorry. This is all my fault. How is this your fault? Lucien rarely got serious. Did you instruct him to hurt me, or could you have stopped him from hurting me? He's just a madman. You can't be blamed for a madman's actions. I couldn't take in his words. My mind was a tangled mess, my thoughts no longer under my control. Lucien finally said, then blame me if you must. It's my fault for being so useless that I got hurt and made you worry. I glared at him, exasperated. He said, so don't blame yourself. I'd rather you blame me. Why are you so good to me? I murmured. Why shouldn't I be good to you? He said earnestly. You deserve all the goodness in this world. Lucien needed to be hospitalized, which meant some daily necessities had to be prepared. His friend Jason Martin drove me back home once again. I quickly packed the items needed for the hospital stay. As I was about to leave, I noticed the cold food on the dining table. I heated it in the microwave and packed it to bring along as well. The atmosphere in the car was tense. Perhaps to ease the tension, Jason spoke up. If Lucien knew his wife was sitting in my passenger seat, he'd definitely be jealous. I felt puzzled. He doesn't get jealous though. How could he not be jealous? Jason looked astonished. He's the most jealous person ever. I suspected we were talking about two different Luciens. Lucien was the type who didn't mind at all when I dated one boyfriend after another. Let me put it this way, Jason continued. Lucien has a document where he's recorded the zodiac signs, blood types, and birth details of all your ex-boyfriends. He's even analyzed their strengths and weaknesses, comparing them to himself. It's more detailed than a product analysis chart. I was dumbfounded. Jason said, sometimes he'd send me a photo and ask, what exactly does this guy have that I don't? I still couldn't believe it. Wasn't I the one who taught Lucien how to be jealous? Jason noticed my expression and blinked. You really didn't know? Has Lucien been hiding it that well? Why would he hide it? He immediately clammed up. I dare not say more. If you want to know, you'd better ask him yourself. At the hospital, I looked at Lucien with suspicion and doubt. Jason had already slipped away. Lucien sat on the hospital bed, eating his belated dinner. While eating, he asked me, what's wrong? Did Jason say something to you? I decided to test the waters first. Do you remember that person we met at the Grand Restaurant? My ex-boyfriend. He nodded. He just contacted me. Said his dad is the director of this hospital and he's willing to help if we need anything. His dad isn't the hospital director though, Lucien said reflexively. I asked, how do you know his dad isn't the director? He fell silent, playing dead as usual. I decided to press on. Is it true that you have a document? He remained silent. Do you really know everything about each of my ex-boyfriends? Still silence. I'll take your silence as a yes. He coughed twice, then turned to ask me, did Jason tell you? Why did you hide it from me? You could have told me if it bothered you. He denied it, saying, it's not that it bothers me. I just wanted to know what made them better than me. They're not better than you. You're the best. He smiled contentedly. I asked again, why didn't you tell me when you were jealous? He started playing dead again. Is this question so hard to answer? After much consideration, he finally said, you had an ex-boyfriend who you dumped because he was too jealous. That's because he was irrationally jealous. Lucien mumbled, I like to be irrationally jealous too. The next second, he promised, but I can hold it in and pretend I'm not jealous. I couldn't help but laugh. You don't have to. You're different from him. He looked delighted for a moment, then brought up another point. You had another ex-boyfriend who you dumped because he checked up on you too much. I said directly, you can check up on me. You had yet another ex-boyfriend who you dumped because he was too clingy. You can be clingy. Looking at the cautious Lucien, I finally understood why he had been hiding his feelings. He was afraid I would dump him. I leaned on his shoulder and said seriously, you can do anything. Whatever you do is fine. I won't break up with you. I promised, as long as you still need me, I won't leave you. Lucien was silent for a long time, until a hand slowly crept around my waist and held on tight. His warm words sounded in my ear. Do you know how jealous I was watching you date one boyfriend after another? He buried his face in the crook of my neck, his voice muffled. I was going mad. I must admit, I'm struggling to cope with Lucien's newly exposed nature. His clinginess was understandable in the hospital, given his limited mobility. But even after being discharged, he remains just as attached. Especially when we're at home, it's as if he can't bear to be apart from me for even a second. Sometimes I'm astonished by the level of affection. Can one really be this clingy? Doesn't he ever get tired of it? Lucien proves through his actions that yes, one can be this clingy, and no, he doesn't tire of it. He's clingy at home and clingy when we're out. That time I simply went shopping with my best friend, his call came chasing after me immediately. He was somewhat restrained in his words, not directly asking when I'd be home, but inquiring if I wanted him to prepare dinner for me and if I needed him to pick me up. I patiently answered each question. After hanging up, I was met with my friend's mockery. She put her arm around my shoulder, teasing, looks like our beautiful penny has fallen hard. It's not that bad, is it? I tried desperately to save face. She continued laughing. Didn't you used to hate this sort of thing? Anyone who dared disturb your shopping spree would get an earful. But Lucien is different, I argued. Oh. How so? She asked. I couldn't answer. I just felt he was different, somehow. The genius always plays at a higher level. When he makes his move, it's truly impressive. Her words made me laugh. Oh, stop it. That day, as usual, Lucien came to pick me up. Although Hugo Sterling had been taken back to his hometown by his father after being released from prison, and likely wouldn't appear before me again, Lucien was still concerned and insisted on driving me everywhere. As soon as we got home, he hugged me from behind, his voice rather pitiful. You only spoke 13 sentences to me today. I hadn't actually counted, but it felt like more. He added, phone calls don't count. I was at a loss with him, patiently asking, so what should we do about that? You could kiss me 13 times to make up for it. He had already turned me around to face him. His actions were forceful, but his eyes looked pitiful. I gazed at his handsome face, hesitating where to begin. Suddenly, he changed his mind. Actually, 13 kisses might be too much. If you don't want to, one kiss is fine. This compromising attitude really tugged at my heartstrings. I quickly planted many kisses all over his face. So many that I couldn't help but laugh by the end. I complained. When I first met you, I never imagined you'd be so clingy. He was supposed to be the cool, handsome type. How did he become a different person when in love? He said again, if you don't like it, I can pretend not to be clingy. I was at a complete loss, then just keep being clingy. Lucien held me, swaying gently as he spoke his true feelings. I feel a bit insecure. You've dumped all your ex-boyfriends for various reasons. I'm afraid one day you might dump me too. That won't happen. I won't break up with you. I know, he said, but I just feel insecure. His voice was pitiful and defeated. I really couldn't bear to hear this. After much thought, I finally came up with a solution. Why don't we go get our marriage license? I looked at him seriously. If we get married, will that make you feel secure? Lucien was stunned for a long while before nodding solemnly, okay. On the day we got our marriage certificate, the weather was bright and clear. It took less than an hour from entering to leaving the registry office. And in that time, the relationship between Lucien and I had fundamentally changed. He clutched the 2 red booklets in his hand, his gaze never wavering from them even as we got into the car. I sat in the passenger seat waiting and waiting until I finally couldn't help but ask, "Darling, aren't we going?" He turned to look at me in surprise, staring for a long while. The corners of his mouth visibly turned upward, and a smile eventually spread across his entire face. He rubbed his cheeks, as if forcing himself to wake up, and said, "Just a moment, I'm posting on social media." He looked at me, hesitantly and shyly calling out, "My wife." I felt a shiver run through my entire body. Lucien took a photo, typed out a message, and posted his very first social media update. L reached the summit. Photo. I asked, "What does that mean?" Lucien said, "It means we'll see even better views together in the future." I felt there was a deeper meaning to it, but I couldn't quite figure it out at the moment, so I let it be. After posting, Lucien received a flood of likes and comments from his friends. He sat in the car scrolling through the well wishes, grinning for another half hour. Afraid it would be dark soon if we waited any longer, I couldn't help but plead. "Darling, I'm hungry. Can we go eat?" "Of course." Lucien finally put away the red booklets and looked at me. "What would you like to eat?" "Anything is fine." The car that had been stationary for so long finally set off. The sun was beautifully slanting on the horizon, and beside me was a wonderful person. He drove me towards a new journey in our lives.